afternoon. Thank you for joining this panel on smart cities this afternoon. Our conversation is about taking connectivity and innovation to the next level. We're going to focus on how cities around the world are increasingly leveraging technology to address a variety of issues, from public safety, lighting, water, waste, energy efficiency, planning, and emergency response. And how do we stay ahead of the curve, ensuring our citizens are protected and prepared? We have an incredible group of speakers today. They're all going to introduce themselves in a few minutes. I just wanted to share a little bit about myself and the work that I've been doing specifically in smart cities. I've been the executive director of Smart Cities New York for the last 3 years, and the focus really is on how do you make a city smart. It's so much more than technology. It doesn't matter if you're a car company, a fashion company, you are a tech company. And so how do we deploy this tech in cities to make sure that they're equitable, livable, and sustainable? Our conference has hosted over presidents and ministers at over 30 global mayors, along with the CEOs of the Boys and Girls Clubs and UNICEF, and thought leaders like Jeffrey Sachs, to really make sure that everyone contributes to making their cities smart. How do you integrate refugees? How do you make sure that people have clean water? That's what truly makes a city smart. I'm pleased to announce that we'll be hosting Smart City Expo Atlanta in September. We are bringing the big tentpole conference that is hosted every year in Barcelona to the United States for the first time, and we've chosen Atlanta to be that place where we showcase the incredible work that, thank you. So we hope that all of you will join us and participate in that conversation. As we dive into the Smart Cities conversation today, you're going to hear from this esteemed panel about truly the efforts that they're making in not only deploying technologies, but sort of where the future's headed, what they're working on right now. And you're going to hear, and Marwan, you can speak to this later, but when we think about smart cities in Columbus, you know, the problem that Columbus was trying to solve was that women couldn't get to the hospital on time to deliver their babies. And so when you come from that human perspective, you will eventually then build a city that allows you to then have emergency response systems and traffic lights and great sensors so that you get to the core problem. And if we keep people at the center of our solutions, that city will be smart. So I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves and give us a little bit of your background, and then we could jump into some questions. Marwan?
Sure. Is this working? Yep. So I'm Marwan Mahdi. I'm a partner at CDM Smith. I have 17 years of experience in transportation, mobility, and intelligent transportation system experience. So here at CDM, we have been engaged in work around emerging technologies for over a couple of decades now, focusing on helping state, regional, and local agencies rethink the way they invest in mobility and infrastructure. We are currently involved with the City of Columbus, focusing primarily on freight connectivity, but we also help them put together a grant response, which was awarded to them from 77 different cities that applied to it. We're also involved with the City of LA and Southern California in general, working also on various types of pilots and deployments in the area of emerging technology, focusing on mobility in general, but also on transit and on freight. And then similar work also in Florida, in the Midwest, tollway agencies, state DOTs, cities, MPOs, et cetera. So I look forward to talk more today about some of that experience that we're involved in, and obviously take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Torri?
Thank you. My name is Toby Martin. I am the interim Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Watershed Management and the Deputy CIO for the City of Atlanta. So in my role, I oversee the technology functions for the Department of Watershed Management. Prior to this, I was the inaugural director of the Smart ATL program, working with my colleague Kirk here, so stood up the Smart City program for the City of Atlanta. Before that, I worked at various other governments, including DC and a city called Fabrin, to where I just help with innovation and things of that nature. I'm originally from Georgia, born in Dublin, Georgia. came to college in Atlanta, and I kind of stayed here. So me and my wife stay here, and I just had twins recently, so I don't get a lot of sleep these days, but I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. Kirk?
My name is Kirk Talbot. I'm now the Chief Information Officer for MARTA. Prior to that, as Torri mentioned, I was the Director of Smart City Program. After he went over to Watershed, I picked up that baton and carried forward with it. Spent about half my career in the public sector, various levels of municipal government, the other half in the private sector on the consulting and IT operations side.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Denise Quarles. I work for Siemens. I serve as the Chief City Executive here in the Southeast region. I have both public and private sector experience. For those of you who are not familiar with Siemens, it's a pretty large organization. I like to say that anytime you think about that critical infrastructure that it takes to make a city run, you should think of Siemens because we're in that space. We have about 350,000 employees. We operate across 190 regions. And if we haven't done it, we've probably seen it. So I am too, I'm looking forward to the discussion this afternoon.
Thank you all. Since you are all on the front lines of change, I'd like to start with what are you currently working on in your individual space, and what are some of the smart city efforts that are rolling out in your particular field? Yep.
So, well, there's a variety of projects that we're working on. So CDM Smith is a full life cycle consulting and engineering firm. So we're involved with strategy, planning, design, deployment, testing, and operation. Examples of projects around strategy, we're working with a couple of cities in the U.S., and I'm not at liberty at this point to discuss which cities these are because they're still working on some of their press releases in terms of what they want to do, but we're sort of helping them strategize on how do they want to revamp their existing programs, and how do they want to sort of upgrade their business models to account for smarter processes, smarter technologies, and decision-making processes, and how do they address water, wastewater, utilities, transportation as part of that. I mentioned in my brief introduction that we are involved with the City of Columbus, so we help them draft a grant which centered around what vision Columbus wants to be when it grows up, between quotation. And it wasn't just focused on technology or focused only on transportation. It was looking at governance, it was looking at accessibility, it was looking at providing services to the elderly, to the disabled, et cetera, but using also transportation, using water and wastewater and utilities to basically make everything more affordable and more accessible to people. And if it's using new processes or new technologies, then be it. We have been focused primarily on a couple of things. One area has been, there was a lot of interest in connected freight. So we helped them test something called truck platooning, which is basically multiple trucks connected via technology, driving on major facilities in and around the city. We developed a concept for them to do that. That concept has been finalized and approved. We're now working with the city, but also with the state, to deploy truck platoons along the I-70 corridor, which is a major corridor for that state. We're also working with the state of Ohio and the city of Columbus to rethink their existing data architecture. So, everyone is thinking about how important emerging technologies are to make our lives better, but the reality is, data is only data if you cannot turn it into information and decision-making processes, right? So we're working with the city and the state around better understanding, if these technologies were to be deployed, what changes do agencies need to do in terms of their existing planning processes, their existing modeling techniques? What kind of data should they be collecting? How should they upgrade their enterprise architecture? How do they make it more secure, more private, et cetera? So that's something that we're doing there. And just very quickly, 2 additional examples. So we're also working for the Illinois Tollway Authority. They too are interested in better understanding what connected and autonomous vehicles will mean to them in the future. And the interesting thing about working with a tollway agency is it's a paying agency. So they have access to a lot of data, a lot more information than your traditional type of agencies have, like cities or MPOs or state DOTs. And so they're interested in, piloting doing a pilot of deploying connected and automated vehicles on their facilities and being able to collect data immediately to better understand the benefits or the disbenefits, if you will, from these types of technologies, what works, what doesn't work, what should change, et cetera. We're also looking at design. So we're working with the state of Montana. They're very interested in emerging technologies, but their focus has been more on what do we need to change in terms of highway design, in terms of needs assessment, identification of needs, and then also their existing infrastructure that manages information. So I can speak much more about this, but I'm just, stop here. So.
Well, Torri, I would love for you to really talk about sort of the data that's being deployed in watershed management and how are you using smart technologies, and also you talked about earlier needing to communicate with your communities about what this all means.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're looking at from a smart utility perspective, which is what we're calling it on our side, is how do we improve the operational facets of the department. So I think Marwan spoke really great to that point about how we leverage the data that we have. We create such a tremendous amount of data, but we only probably use about 3 to 5, maybe 10% of that data. And so there's so much other data that we're not using that can really help us inform the decisions that we're making. But not only that, how do we leverage what operations that we're doing with the expectations and how it impact the community? So one of the things that our Office of Customer Care and Billing Services does, they've done what they call a customer mapping journey. So they brought in customers and they sat down and kind of walked through the process of how do they interact with us, how do they pay their bills, how do they receive information and things of that nature. And so we're utilizing that on how to improve our services that we deliver to them. And so, one of the things that I always like to tell people, and I told y'all earlier, is that, it's not about the technology at the end of the day. It's about the people, the policies, and the process first. If you can get those things straightened out or worked out first, a lot of times the technology solves itself for you. There are various different technologies that you can use to impact the way you do business. But if you don't have the support of the people that have to utilize that technology, then it's never going to go anywhere. And so you'll never get to whatever the concept of a smart city or a smart utility is. Some of the things that we're working on that you asked earlier, we're working on things from like a solar initiative. So where we're going to try to deploy floating solar panels on one of our reservoirs. We're also looking to install solar panels at a few of our facilities as an initial stage to kind of see how that works and how that offsets energy to make us good stewards of fund. We also have SCADA upgrades that we're doing. We're also looking at ways to better prioritize the investment that we put into our linear infrastructure. So which pipes should we replace before other pipes? We've done pilots surrounding satellite leak detection. So how do you really use satellite data to really pinpoint and triage where massive leaks are occurring and minor leaks or things that could potentially come up? One of the things that I'm actually really proud of that we're doing is from a people standpoint, one of the things that we're getting ready to launch in partnership with our communications team is we're launching an employee app. So one of the things that I've heard since being in this role is that some of the field staff is not always receiving information, not always engaged as they should be. So what we're hoping to do is to deploy this app that will help solve some of that. So where they can view videos from leadership and things of that nature, or receive emails, or look at policies, or have some question and answer FAQ type things on that to help them with that, so that they can just seem like they're involved in the process as well. Kind of like Marwan, I can go on for a long about the various projects that we have going on. But once again, I really want people to realize that, to me, Smart City is dealing with the people, the policies, and the process, and making sure that they have the tools and enabled to be successful.
So you touched on customer experience, which I know Kirk is very focused on with MARTA. Tell us a little bit more about how you're innovating at MARTA and sort of some of the projects that you're working on, in addition to a great customer experience.
So there are really two drivers right now at MARTA. One is to refresh the customer experience. Anyone that's taken MARTA can look at the system and understand where we're at, and it's not where we would like to be. So there's a phenomenal push internally to improve the customer experience, which leads to a number of different projects to refresh the stations, refresh the infrastructure, but more importantly, to get back to the quality of service that's delivered, to get better information quality. We're going through a deep scrubbing right now of really making sure that the information that we have, and we have a wealth of information already in the system, it's a fairly mature model, is correct, accurate, and timely. And what that's doing is, it's kind of a side benefit, is it's driving us to build a better data maturity model so that we're able to take not only information we have, but as we garner new information, be able to share that more efficiently, more transparently, more appropriately. So we're building the internal capabilities for that. The second main driver is a massive wave of expansion. We're going to be adding over $2 billion worth of network expansion over the coming years. And so that means we're going into a heavy growth mode. And when you have an opportunity like that, you have to put down the right infrastructure, make sure it's done well, it's done cost efficiently, but it's also an opportunity to inject innovation at the very fabric of the network. And so we're looking at ways that we can incorporate leading edge technologies into that so that it's built in from the beginning.
Great. And Denise, you have been on the public sector side, you're now on the private sector side. Tell us some of the things that you may be working on and some of the efforts that you're seeing being rolled out around smart cities.
Sure. I think I'll feed off of something that Torri just said, which is it's not a technology problem, it's a people problem. And so I think it's important, instead of talking about how to become a smart city, understand your why. Because I think that is actually where it does need to start. The list of things that you could be touching on are from here to that wall long, but it's important to really understand what are the issues. Whether a city is large or it's small, or whether you're talking about a corporation or you're talking about your house. There's a lot of different technology out there that can be implemented and executed, but the priorities are different, right? And so for me, I know when I decided to smart out my house, there were a lot of things I was specifically looking for because I have young children, and so it's helpful for me to be able to put in some camera systems in place and to know where they're home. I get an alert on my phone, when my kids are just a couple of miles away from home, or sometimes I'll get that alert and I'll say, hang on a second, they should be at school, right? And so, again, you have to understand that why. Again, the categories are the same. We all want our cities to be safe, and we want to have quick and easy access to transit. But some cities have more of a transit issue, like Atlanta, versus others. And so when you're trying to say, what is all this out there? Torri made a comment earlier and he said, I'm not really looking for a vendor to knock on my door pushing technology. What I think you'll find a little bit different about the organization that I represent is we first want to stop and help me understand what your issues are. Because if I can understand what your issues are, I can then start to talk to you about those technology solutions. Because smart cities focus on people. Right, and the technology is going to follow. We've been in business for 170 years, and so we're here to stay. And we are a technology global house, but we got here because we are actually designing and engineering products and services that benefit people. And so that's been one of the focuses for us. Helping cities who are saying, I'm ready to take that journey, but trying to figure out where is it that they start, and then how do you leverage the technology? And sometimes that technology is in our portfolio, and sometimes it's not. There is no one organization out there that does it all, but like I said, I think with our global lens, we've seen a lot. And so the main things that we're focusing on is saying, let's stop and step back and understand what your issues are, and then to try to come up and pair a solution with that.
So for the rest of this panel, I'm going to stop using the word smart city because we all have a different definition, and by the end of it, we're going to come up with one that works for all of us. I would love to hear from all of you, and in any order, are there cities around the world in your specific field, whether it be watershed or transportation, that you feel like are doing a good job in making their cities more equitable, livable, sustainable. I say that because part of my work is to be able to share best practices from around the world. And I remember a few years ago, we brought the night mayor of Amsterdam to New York. And Amsterdam has a thriving nightlife, and it's safe in the evening, and New York ended up adopting a night mayor to be able to increase economic development at night. And I'm curious, are there other cities, either globally or domestically, Kirk, that you think are doing great work in transit?
So since you named me, I of course have an affinity for Atlanta. On the transportation side, we're playing catch up. I won't pretend that we're somehow leading. The advantage though of being not in first place is you can look to others to see what they're doing and you can leapfrog and jump ahead. I don't think there's any one city that has the complete package, but there are some cities that leap out and you say, wow, there's some interesting things going on there. Off the top of my head, and this is before I got into transportation, Tel Aviv is doing some amazing things. And what strikes me about them is they have more than one focus. They seem to have gotten that concept that it's a holistic approach, and they're really putting their citizens first, and they're coming up with some really interesting activities that show that. I'm personally excited on the transportation side about some work that's going on in Orange County, California, not actually a city. It's my opinion, nothing personal yet, but I think they may have cracked the code on the next mode in transit, which is kind of a strange love child between fixed route service and Uber, so bus service and Uber, and keeping an eye on them.
Great. Orange County, I didn't know that. Torri, what are you seeing in terms of watershed? Are there any, I know the Dutch and other countries and the Nordic countries are really focused in this area, but are you seeing, the biggest issue we have in the US is legacy infrastructure, right? Whereas other parts of the world can sort of leapfrog and have different procurement issues. Tell us what you're seeing.
But piggyback on Kirk, I would also probably say Singapore for transportation. They do a pretty good job as well.
Well, I have to add Helsinki, I forgot.
Yeah.
I'm really in love with what they're doing. Go ahead, sorry.
But from the watershed or utility perspective, Dubai is doing really good things, but then they also can print money. So
That helps.
So that does help.
Yeah.
That does help. But they are really doing some tremendous things over there. Also, Barcelona has some certain aspects that they are really doing well at. The issue, not issue, but the thing about it is it depends on what facet you're talking about. And so to go back to what Kirk says, there might be a sliver where they might be doing something with flood mitigation or things of that nature. But those two are definitely international ones that I would look at. And then more nationally, LA Power and Water doing good things. DC Water is doing really good things as well. I'm trying to think.
And they're giving back to the
And they're
community.
giving back to the community. I'm trying to think who else. Oh, Finland actually has a really good model as far as what they're doing over there, as far as from automation and shrinking the need for overhead. They're doing actually a really good job in that. I think those are the ones that I've been seeing. And in Atlanta as well in certain aspects. We're one of the few utilities that have smart utility as actually a strategic priority. Us in Las Vegas, which is a part, it's, strangely enough. So I think, so it depends on the aspect. So when you're thinking about foresight, leadership, I definitely will put Atlanta up there. We do have some aging infrastructure and things of that nature that we're working on getting together, but I think we're in the mix as well.
So Helsinki is really interesting. So the mayor's perspective is he wants to give 1 hour back to each of his citizens. And that's where he starts. And so he's been making everything else really efficient. Marwan, what are you seeing?
So I think, so I'm going to go back to something Denise said, which is what are your needs and what are your issues? And to me, this is where you can see some of the successes in some parts of the country and globally versus others. So you mentioned Kirk Tel Aviv. They did a lot of stakeholder engagement for a long period of time before they decided what they wanted to look at. A couple of other examples. So the city of Boston. When we talk about smart cities, we think it's just one big giant black box where you have to do everything. It's actually incremental. I mean, if something is working to your advantage, then you should continue it. If there's an aspect that doesn't work, then you should look at it. So they determined that their biggest problem was actually double parking. And also, they have issues with people crossing intersections and just staying there. You're from Boston, so maybe you're familiar with some of those problems. And so they've decided to partner with Waze, and they're using Waze to help police, but also the community, to make more intelligent decisions about where to park, how to park, and then when to actually cross the intersection. So it had a double effect, because it wasn't just about the gotcha situation where I want to, ticket you. But, some people just genuinely think that they can just park here for a short time and it wouldn't be an issue. Or, when they're crossing the intersection, that it's not going to cause a big bottleneck. And that has actually reduced ticket issuance by 20%. And I forgot the number when it comes to travel time. LA Metro, you talked about Orange County. LA Metro is thinking about ways to handle the Olympics that's coming to them in the next 8 years. So they're starting to look at, well, what's my role as a transportation agency in this environment? How do I take advantage of my processes, my planning techniques, but also technology? And so I know you talked earlier, Kirk, about, the concept of mobility as a service, if you will. And so they're trying to test that. Can I actually provide visitors and people that live here with an option to say, at this point of time, where do I need to be and by what time and how much does it cost? And then I make decisions accordingly. So it's a work in progress. It's a very interesting idea. So just a couple of examples.
And Denise, what are you seeing around the world or domestically that you think is a good model around?
Yeah, well, I think they've given some great examples, but I think it all really leads to the fact that it's a journey. A lot of these projects that have been mentioned have been pilot programs, and a lot of these pilots have gone well, but it leads us into the challenge of how do you really take some of these pilots to scale,
Right.
which I think a lot of cities are struggling with. A couple of the projects that haven't been mentioned is the Tampa Hillsborough Express Authority is working on a really cool connected vehicle project. Chicago was one of the first cities looking at some of the open data portals. And, Torri mentioned the project here along North Avenue. So again, they're all really cool projects. But what we're also seeing now is that you'll see a lot of cities issue smart city RFXs, and so, and they kind of put out this list of things, we want a smart fleet, and we want intelligent infrastructure solutions, and we want a smart water system. And so, I think that's where that next progression is going, is that trying to figure out how do you cast a much wider net. I don't think that we've been as successful as we'd like to be here in the U.S. with trying to figure that out. But I do think that there's been a good effort in trying to figure out how do you establish some of these consortiums of partners to make these things happen. So very much still a journey.
So I think the consortium part is really interesting, and everyone sort of touched upon pilots. I want to ask about, sort of startup ecosystems. It's such a hot button topic in cities across, but you're right, you have these startups, but then how do you scale? And that's a bigger issue when you're solving for transportation, right? You can't just have a startup come in and help you. And I'm curious, how do we scale, because procurement seems to be such a big issue, and cities can't have the time for the R&D, and they don't want to be sold to by big companies that are saying, come in and use my tech. So how do we find the solutions to make our cities smarter? Is it if you had a wish list of how you could better execute the programs within each of your departments, what would that look like? Would it be coming in and having a million startups coming in and pitch to you, or would it be, tell me what that would look like.
We actually are building an innovation pipeline, for lack of a better word, where not just taking solutions thrown at us or potential solutions thrown at us, but we're going upstream and saying, we have, like you said, a mile-long list of problems. How do we prioritize those problems? Which of those problems are we going to solve internally, and which are we going to vet options from the public? And that doesn't mean the same thing as an RFP or an RFI. I hadn't heard RFX. I'll have to
I
ask
love
you.
it. I'm taking it.
Yeah. What does the X stand for?
whether it's an RFP, an RFI, or an RFQ.
Oh, okay, so it's an
RFX.
anything. Okay,
Yes.
okay, it's to be determined. I thought it was a new type of,
No.
okay.
I'm still using it. I don't care.
Yeah, it's good. But creating that governed process for prioritization, and we started to do that at the city of Atlanta, but given the size of it, it's a harder problem at that scale. At MARTA, I think we will have an effective process in the next few months internally, and then you can communicate externally to vendors, here are the problems that we would love to get your input. We're actually working with Georgia Tech to say not everything is a for-profit solution. Some of it might be research-based, some of it might be internal. But really saying, here's the pipeline of what we're looking at. I think the pilot process is fairly well understood. Where we ran into the problems most often with government is after you've found a solution that has the return on investment that makes it worth scaling. I argue that scaling is not a problem because if your solution solves a big enough problem, checks will be written. There's always enough money to solve the really big problems. But it's getting through that government procurement process because the processes, as everybody in this audience knows, were written about 150 years ago to reflect a reality about 150 years ago. And many of the things that we run into as issues were cleverly disguised as inappropriate procurement behaviors. So the mechanism actually resists things such as, hey, I went out into the market, I found this great solution, I want to buy this one. No, we have to ask everyone. Well, that solution didn't exist until 5 minutes ago, so there is no everyone, right? So you get into that knot. I think that's where we're gonna have the biggest problem, but once we get through that, and there are means of doing it, once we get through that procurement knot, then you can scale because your ROI is there. I think a lot of times people fall back on the process is too hard, we can't scale. What they're really saying behind the scenes is we didn't solve a big enough problem that returned enough to make it worth the effort. Because like I said, if you cured cancer, I guarantee you there would not be a procurement officer standing there going, no, we need to get 3 solutions, right? You would find a way.
right.
And we've seen testament to GDOT, they rebuilt a bridge in what, 35, 45 days?
Yeah, something crazy.
We wouldn't have been able to put the statement of work together in 45 days under a normal circumstance, right? Even though it's a bridge and we know what bridges do, and it would still take us more than 45 days. So where there's a will, there's a way.
And, you talked about how if there's a big enough problem, so taking it to Ohio, for example, when they were thinking about freight-connected technologies, everything was on the table. Am I looking at autonomous trucks? Am I looking at truck platooning? Am I looking at advanced traffic connected systems or whatever you call them? And so they used the pilot to test different ideas. And along the process, there was engagement of all sorts of stakeholders, really people that you wouldn't have thought would be engaged in that process, but they were part of the discussion. You know how earlier we're talking about, one of the problems of mobility is women being able to get to the hospital on time to deliver their babies in a healthy way, where they were part of that discussion because, if there's a delay on the highway and if it's freight related, they're part of the equation.
Right.
And so they did the piloting, the results were promising in certain areas. They took the pilot to a larger pilot level, if you will, where they looked at a much larger scale. And then now they're talking about deploying connected freight along I-70 and then even getting, neighboring states like Pennsylvania and Indiana on the table. So when the problem is big, as you're saying, Kurt, but then when you're starting to see some potential solutions, then there's a way for you to get around that. It's not going to be a push of a button, but at least there are building blocks to get there.
I tend to agree with Kirk as well on this one. There's a pipeline. I think, we established a pipeline for the Smart City program at the city, the process of how you introduce things and then how it rolls out to a small, to a larger, to then citywide deployment. I think that, to his point, though, the issue about scaling is more so around that procurement method and really working with the procurement officials to, one, understand, a lot of them, let me walk that back a tad bit before I say that. The issue is that there is not a great understanding of technology and how technology impacts the procurement process. Was that
Correct.
Politically correct?
Yeah, and I would add to that technology keeps changing, which is
Yes.
not conducive to a predictable procurement process.
Right.
Right.
So that's that part where we gotta, it's basically we have to see how there's a way to inject some agile methodology into the procurement process. Because as it stands right now, it's a lot of times behind the products that you're trying to procure. And then by the time you procure the products, you need to actually be going to a different product. So it's just this never-ending cycle. But to his point, if you can solve the problem today, you know, the checks will be written tomorrow. It's just how do you get the checks to the person in order to do it from a government perspective.
Denise?
So I think the only other thing I'll add to that is, you know, also talking about impacts. So one of the tools that we have is called a city performance tool. And what the city performance tool does is that it looks at buildings, it looks at energy, it looks at transit. And so, you know, again, you know, sometimes you'll see cities set some pretty big goals that they want to reduce, you know, their carbon footprint by X%. You know, we talk about some of the smarter technology to help, you know, clean the environment, but, you know, it doesn't always mean that where you're focusing your efforts is really going to help you make an impact. And so what we've been working with cities are to say is that let's talk about some technologies that can actually be leveraged to help you get there. And so this tool looks at about 70 or so technologies. About half of those technologies are in our portfolio, the other half are not. So it's not just this Siemens-centric tool that you're going to get. But what it does do is it helps you understand and you say, you know what, I want to go down this electric vehicle route. You might see from the data in that tool that electric vehicles are actually not the answer. You know, you would make a bigger and greater impact by going with X. And so being able to understand, you know, where are you making those investments and what's going to be the impact is important. And that's one of the things that a tool similar to one of the ones that we have in our portfolio does.
I find the data aspect so interesting for all of you because, Kirk, in your situation, like if you could show how many travelers are at one station at a certain time, like you would alleviate waiting line. I mean, you would alleviate so much. And I've actually seen your city performance tool as it relates to climate and just people understanding that there are other solutions, but you have to visualize the data in order to make those decisions. And I'm curious, Kirk, you mentioned Georgia Tech earlier. Are you guys using a lot of academic research to support, you know, to help people in procurement in other ways to say, like, this is research not done by Siemens or not done by anyone else, but that shows how traffic should flow or what some of the issues are? Like, is that helpful to you?
So it's interesting that the relationship at MARTA carried over from the city. We started the relationship with Georgia Tech at the city, but I would say there's it's a symbiotic relationship. So on the one hand, Georgia Tech helps the agency or agencies answer questions they're not sure about. So we did some work on North Avenue, made some technology investments, and then Georgia Tech went and did the deep research of what is the environmental impact of those technologies. How do we separate the cause from the effect? You know? The other half is we just got done with an enclave for a semester where Georgia Tech students came into MARTA and they were analyzing our data processes. And they were understanding better how data flows in an organization, but they were also helping us to understand how we could improve data flow in the organization. So it became a mutually beneficial study of how we behave. I haven't seen a limit yet to what we're doing with the universities, but what's nice is they absolutely have their drivers, but they give us a perspective and they give us a view into ourselves that we wouldn't have otherwise, that probably wouldn't be commercially competitive if we were to go out and write a check to do that, but it's beneficial to everybody.
That's great. Are you using research in any way to help with your work, or it's sort of not?
Using what? I'm sorry.
Research, like, is that helpful?
When I transitioned into role, like Kirk said, the relationship that I had with Georgia Tech as well partnered over with us to kind of look at how can we better predict flow. Academic research is there. I mean, Georgia Tech is doing leaps and bounds research into various areas. It's just about how does it actually fit with what we're trying to accomplish. And then I think, as he said, there's this symbiotic relationship that we just have to, understand that, and see how we can make it a win-win for everybody. One of the things that I've tried to standing up is actually an academic advisory committee. So not just Georgia Tech, but we're looking at Georgia State, the AUC as well to participate in it, to really help with some of the, I hate that I'm saying again, smart city initiatives that for them to hey, based on the research that you guys are seeing out there, what are you guys noticing? We're busy in the day-to-day management of it, so a lot of times we can't really get into the research of the various things. Yeah. So to have this objective third party that really is focused on the research, or even doing exploratory research, I think it really adds a value add to when you make a decision about a direction, a path, a solution, or whatever the case might be. It adds that extra layer of validity. That's like, okay, we've done our due diligence. Whatever happens, we've done what we can to this point. Yeah.
And along those lines, I think public-private partnerships are the key at the moment. I know that MasterCard did this great program where they were mapping the data of people who were going through hospitals and prisons and seeing the cycle of them and they did that in Baltimore. I was at a conference at MIT where they used the data from the sewer system to analyze opioid abuse and where it was in their communities. And so these are things that cities don't have the ability or access or R&D to be able to do. So it is important to have these public-private partnerships.
And just to piggyback off MasterCard, we actually partnered with them, with the city of Atlanta, to where they help with economic development. So they actually was able to show us, hey, this is where a lot of economic development activity will happen. So they really do have a lot of data that in a traditional sense, the city would have never thought about, okay, how can we really move the needle in economic development until actually going through that process of working with them and really being able to show that information.
I think I'm not sure where you're headed, but I think that's one of the more interesting but subtler benefits to Smart City, which is as organizations, be they private sector like MasterCard or be they public sector like a city or a utility, start to generate and they get the maturity to be able to share that data, you start to find better insights, you can run analytics against them. We had a fascinating conversation with Georgia Tech just yesterday where we were discussing people have 1,000 hypotheses about if I could do X or if I knew Y, then I could trace and start to try and address some problem. I think as regions, as government starts to bring that data online and make it, as our former boss used to say, democratize it, because it's already been paid for, then you'll start to see these phenomenal insights. There'll be a lot of experiments, there'll be a lot of hypotheses that don't lead to anything good, but that first step is to get that information flowing so that people can start to analyze, run hypotheses, and run tests on them.
Where I was heading with that was, Denise and Marwan, because you guys are at a place where you can provide the research and the data, one of the next questions I was going to ask was really how do we prevent from overspending? And when you receive this data from these private sectors, the city can make better decisions, right, in terms of preventing overspending and making sure they're on budget, because it's so trial and error.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we do, so internally at CDM Smith, we do a lot of R&D, which is something that helps us a lot with our clients in terms of making decisions. We also follow the lean process, which is basically, you don't have to go all the way through if you're finding problems along the way. So you need to have checkout points along the way, and maybe stop, maybe kill a project. So you and I were talking earlier, how long is too long. So if you're testing something and it's not generating, this is where the problem is. You can't be sitting there and just waiting for the best idea to pop up to do it, because that's never going to happen. But really the best ideas are the ones that stem from trial and error, but knowing when to say, okay, this is an error, I'm going to stop, and then I'm going to try something different. That's where you save your money and don't waste it. So there are techniques to follow to ensure that, but trial and error is definitely something that needs to happen along the way. So does that answer the question?
Of course. Yeah. I was going to have Denise.
Yeah, and I'll give an example. When you think about those vertical assets like a street light, Right. You know, there's about 10 or so different things you can do to smart out a street pole. But that doesn't mean all 10 of those are good applications for your particular city. One of the things, you know, that we look at is that we'll do a GIS mapping. And so we might take and look at the 1,000, you know, street poles that you have in your particular city, and we'll be able to come back and tell you of those 1,000, you know, 10% of them are actually in our high crime-stricken areas. So maybe you want to put gunshot detectors there. You know, we may tell you that 20% are near sensitive populations, and so this is a good place that you might want to put some air quality sensors there. We may want to tell you that this is located next to a bus stop area, and maybe you want to put wayfinding. You know, maybe you want to put a smart trash receptacle. You know, maybe you want to put some other intelligent traffic solutions in that particular space. And so I think it's important to understand who your partners are, and to understand, again, it still gets back to me, what are your needs? Because there's so many different things out there. There's so many various options. And, you know, like I said, you know, for those 10 different things that we could rattle off to say that's on a poll, there still isn't even one company who makes all of those 10 particular products. So, you know, it's overwhelming. And that's why I think you're starting to see a lot more consortiums of partners get together to try to figure out how do we leverage those solutions, because it all gets back to how is it benefiting those constituent stakeholders that are out there.
Right. But even, and that's a good point, but even with that, let's say you're talking about a high crime area, even focusing on, okay, so we need to sort of address this particular area because it's having a particular problem. Even within that particular area, you have to determine what's the best solution to address the problem, right? And so that's going to require in itself some sort of trial and error. I guess the point that I'm making is, as much as you try to make it close to a place where you know, you're really relating it to their needs, human beings, it's very hard to predict how they're going to react to certain things. You know, when Uber came to be, it wasn't necessarily very clear how this is going to be transforming the way we travel and we live. You know, but it has, and at this stage, we don't know what connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles are going to do to the way we move and we live. What we know is we're testing it, and that's the best thing that can be done. Now, can you test it better? Because you understand better what the priorities are? Yes. You know, if you're in a, let's say if you're in the state of Wyoming, you know, offering them transit solutions may not make sense because Wyoming is not a dense state and Wyoming's priorities are mostly related to freight. If you're in New York City, then looking at transit solutions make a lot more sense. So I agree with Denise, but I still think that there will be some of the trial and error that you cannot escape from.
And I think this is what leads to that dichotomy that we have, to where government entities, we're risk averse.
Right.
You know, we don't like failure because we have to be great stewards of public dollars. So we can't invest into these, I'm going to call them these aspirational projects as much because, you know, we have very limited resources. So I think this is the beautiful point to where how a private-public partnership can actually benefit each other. Being able to leverage the resources from an external party that is okay and comfortable with failure, which is what innovation is about. You know, you have to really think about the failures of it in order to truly innovate, because that's where you learn the greatest about your organization, about your life, and things of that nature as well. So we're not at that level from a governmental standpoint, but I think as we start talking more about innovation and how cities can become better, they're really going to have to start thinking about being comfortable with failure.
So that takes us into what cities will look like 5 or 10 years from now. And, you know, again, I hate the term smart cities and it's all shiny objects, but really at the end of the day, it's, you know, cities aren't used to adapting to all of the plastic and the garbage and the people that are in its cities. And I'm speaking as a New Yorker, which it's very, like, we don't want to talk about drone taxis. Like, we have to just pick up our garbage. But I am curious, though, because in your positions, your job is to look around the corner and to make sure that your city is prepared for what's coming next, and whether that is a drone taxi or, we think about autonomous cars, they will help the disabled and the blind get to the hospital, and they will increase mobility. And there's certain opportunities around it, and yet, you have a transit system that you need to make sure is equitable and that everyone can participate in it. And I'm just curious from all four of you as we wrap up this discussion is, what do you see around the curve in your specific areas, and in the next 5-10 years is a long time, but in the next even 5 years?
Well, I'll start off. So in the water industry, I would say it's not as long, because a lot of our capital projects, I think it takes a long time to do it. So if you're replacing pipes, it takes a long time to replace pipes. So 5 to 10 years is probably not as long, but I understand the gist of it. But I will say that I think that one thing that we will see from cities as a whole will be the better utilization of data. That's the trend that's already started. I think that's going to be that first vision of what a smarter or better performing city is using data across the various silos, like Kirk said earlier, democratizing the data to really be able to pull insights, not just from water, but also say, hey, we are doing this pipe project here. How does that impact MARTA and their ability to get their customer from point A to point B, to how does that impact the permit process, to how does that impact the finances for the city. I think the first tier is really going to be cities really starting to get it and understand the value and the worth of data and start really utilizing that. We have to start somewhere, and I think that's really going to be where we start, because I hate to say it, it's probably one of the easier ones to start with is the actual data, because we have so much of it and we don't use it.
So I'm going to I agree with the data part. I think that's a very important period. But given that also, I think of Amazon, and we had that conversation. So I'm based in Washington, D.C., and a lot of us...
I'm based in New York City. We lost Amazon. Just
competition. So, a lot of us in Washington, D.C. really no longer physically go to shop for anything. Everything comes home. So, if you're walking in downtown DC and you're looking at all the freight trucks, they're not your big freight trucks. They're pretty much, if you have a 4x4, that's basically the truck. So in that kind of environment, there's going to be a rethinking of what constitutes a freight route, what constitutes a distribution center, where is it going to be located? It used to be Woodbridge, which is about 2 hours outside of DC, where everything gets distributed and moved to the doors of the city, and then another distribution happens within the city. Well, if things are coming to your door, then you have to rethink all of that. So
Right.
you know how we were talking earlier about not everything is just about technology? Because technology is, the data helps you to make better decisions, but the better decisions include physical decisions. Do I need to have narrower lanes, larger lanes? Do I need to have a distribution center closer? Do I need to change my rules and regulations when it comes to people that are driving? Is an Uber driver just an Uber driver or an Uber/truck freight driver? So I think these are going to be some of the issues that very urban areas are going to be facing, and so that's one of the things that I see becoming more front and center in the next 5-10 years, especially that really Amazon is taking over pretty much everything. Anything that you want to buy, you can buy it on Amazon, and they're trying to offer the full life cycle, which is I will operate, I will buy the goods, I will display them, I will bring them to you. There is no third party in the middle. At least that's what they're aiming to do, making it all one company.
so city planning is really, it's going to be important.
Is city
here.
planning in terms of the new
Yep.
vision for
anticipating
and,
all of these,
goods movement,
Yeah.
which is something that is evolving.
Yeah.
But even with city planning, it's just that still is one of those things that's not a 5-year, 10-year plan.
Oh, no, yeah.
Right.
It's still gonna be that.
Agreed.
So I think
Agreed.
the 5 to 10 years is a little short-sighted when you think about governments and how they're really slow-turning ships. Because when we went to Barcelona, they talked about how it was intentional how they planned their streets. And it wasn't a 2 or 3 or 5 year.
Right.
It was literally, what did they say, about a 20-year
Yeah.
process to really get it to it.
Right.
So it's just one of those things that it's a process that's going to take a while.
And given the changes of all these technologies, as Kurt was saying, it's hard for you to really measure the impact of a technology, because by the time you know what it's doing, something else comes up that promises better solutions. So yes, you have access to all that data, but what is the data telling you? It's telling you where people are and when they're moving, but it's not really telling you how it's necessarily affecting the system. And you need to give it some time to say, okay, I need to invest in platoons or connectivity or automation.
Kurt?
So I think Torri's right. It will start with data. If you were to jump in a time machine 10 years from now, cities I don't think will look that different, because it does take time for that fabric to change. But I think what will happen is the data will enable new emerging business models, and that's really where you're seeing the disruption coming from. Across the same fabric, those new emerging business models will put new stresses, or they'll shift the stress of an environment, like you see with Uber, Airbnb, whatnot. The governance always lags. And what I think you will see, you won't see the governance have caught up in the next 5-10 years, but I think, and you hinted about it when we talked about waste and food distribution, all those are really governance problems. When you get density, you now have to have very well-defined rules of how do you govern 1 billion people in one space. But I think you will also, because government reacts slowly, I think you will see private sector governance solutions coming into play, where people take the new technology, they take new business models, and they start to provide what we once considered government services that are not exactly privatized, but they're responding to it. Case in point, and I see this, and it's fascinating, when you look at CIDs here in Atlanta. You're not supposed to say this out loud, but what they're really doing is they're taking private sector dollars and they're delivering government services that the city could not fund at the level that that community wanted to have, right? I think you're going to see more of that, and it's going to be enabled by the data that's flowing out of the civic space. That's how you're going to see changes in dense areas.
Well, you've just teed it up for Denise to end on the private sector's contribution.
And it's interesting. It's not much to add to what the guys have already said, but I will add that in terms of roles, I think one that's critical out there is these data scientists. There's so much information that's out there, but is that information truly being leveraged and understood is a different point. And I think that when you talk about what are some of those key critical roles that are going to be needed, data scientists is big. It's very big.
Thank you all. We can now open it up for some Q&A if anyone has any questions. In the back.
What role do you see blockchain playing in smart cities?
That ties to your cloud question.
Kirk, we'll let you do.
Yeah, I'll take it. I don't mind. Do you mean practically, or do you mean the hyperbole?
I was going to ask again, what role do you see blockchain playing in smart
Oh, do you mean practically, or do you mean hyperbole? Which answer do you want?
practical application?
So it's going to take some time. Again, I think what blockchain does is it gives a transparency to governance that has not been technically possible before. So where I see it eventually settling, and I don't know how long it will take, is when you think of the job of government, it's I trust you to track my land deed for 1,000 years. I trust you to track my marriage certificate for 100 years, whatever it is. I think you're going to start to see those services automated on some next generation blockchain that is endorsed and authorized by government, but it's automated through the technology. When you look at the billions, maybe trillions of dollars that are spent on just documentation, policy enforcement, those sorts of things, they're ripe for disruption in blockchain. The problem is it's not going to be government that probably disrupts, it's going to be private sector, and this is not a space that private sector typically has worked with. They don't deal with documents at the national level. But I think that's where you're going to see it. It's going to be starting to automate about 1/3 of what government services have been historically considered to do.
And just to add to it, so I would say, to make it a little bit more definitive for me, it's not going to play a large role yet. And I think it goes back to what Kirk said earlier. It's a disruptive technology that governments don't really have a handle around how to govern it. So they're going to push it to last until they fully understand it. And then once they understand it, once you start getting new people into workforce, new people into government that are helping with making the decisions, then you will see it catch up.
Yeah, I'll tell you the two jobs I'd be afraid in if I were in government and these jobs to be disrupted. City clerk and county clerk. Anybody whose job is to take records and guarantee that those records are still accessible to everybody and in an unaltered way. And that's the essence of, thousands of people in county and city level government.
Another question?
Sure. We didn't have any discussion really around artificial intelligence and where you think that's going in your industry, where you collect all this data and then, you learn from it and you move on, or the computer learns from it.
I mean, for the water sector, we definitely would be utilizing that. I mean, from condition assessments of pipes and things of that nature, that's a wonderful application that AI helps with, and we actually are piloting some of that right now. So I actually see that AI will probably be one of those things that will be more receptive by governments going forward, and probably in the next 5 to 10 years, you'll probably really see that being utilized a pretty good.
Yeah, we've already started experimenting. I think it will become second nature embedded in systems that either have to make local decisions. The biggest challenge, and it's fascinating that New York is already struggling with this, is how do you audit the algorithms that no human ever wrote,
Yeah.
right?
That's
To
the
ensure
problem.
that there's equality in outcomes and all that. It's a fascinating space. But I think we will tackle that, and I think it will be embedded. For example, with the work we did on North Avenue, the traffic signals are already being nudged, for lack of a better word, by artificial intelligence. We're looking at MARTA at how do we know what's the optimal vehicle to put on each route, each day, based on weather, special events, forecasted demand, all that. Humans don't do that well. AI could do that in its sleep. So I think it's inevitable. It'll free up people to focus more on the policy decisions and not on the mechanical operational decisions.
And just one more, we actually worked on a project with IBM Together for Safer Roads to where we actually utilize artificial intelligence to kind of say, hey, tomorrow this is going to be a likelihood of a major accident or something happen, to where based off of projected forecasts, traffic conditions. I mean, it took a lot of the information. So that is being utilized.
Yeah.
And I know they used it in other cities as well.
Yeah, it's happening.
So.
Yeah, and the Illinois Tollway Authority is actually now using it for vehicle classification, but also for plate number tracking and issuing violation tickets. I mean, it's not a pretty picture, but it's helpful for them.
On the flip side, AI is being used for facial recognition and predictive analytics in the city I live in. So, it's a double-edged sword, and I'm so glad you asked the questions about AI and blockchain, because they are instrumental to smart cities. Blockchain's being used for food security, and you can see the transparency in the supply chain. Austin's using it for digital identity for the homeless. And Denver has been using it for voting. So there are applications. I think for us, it was really, digging in deep into the work that's happening and to make our cities smart. And while there are all these great technologies in AI and blockchain and machine learning, at the end of the day, they're components to a bigger
But I think it's inevitable. When you talk about scale, humans don't work well at scale. When
Right.
you're talking about making decisions, millions. I think it's just like asking 100 years ago, what's the place of electricity in cities, right? We've got all these gas lamp lights, and you can put all these people out of work. When you scale, you have to adopt. 100 years from now, we won't even be talking about it. It'll be foundational to everything that we build.
Yep. Any more questions?
I have a question. My name is Jimmy Motan, and I'm the founder of Skylar Security. We're a non-traditional private security company, and we leverage innovation. So my question to you is, what trends are you seeing around smart cities and innovation to stay ahead of the security conversation? Of course, everyone always thinks terror attacks and things of that nature, but I think our community, I used to be a police officer, I feel like our community on the ground level, that's where the conversation needs to start. What trends have you seen, and Denise or the others, you guys can answer that. What are you seeing that are possible solutions that are trending across the US? I'd love to hear that answer.
So, we're in some pretty interesting times. It's almost sad, and I think, I don't know how you came here, bus, train, walked, biked, taking one of the electric scooters outside, but you probably have had your picture taken 100 times between getting from point A to point B. And so I think from a security standpoint, I don't think we can be too safe. We have a pretty large security portfolio from, badging in and out of buildings, cybersecurity. We check those respective boxes. What we are finding is that, again, it's just trying to figure out which is the right application, can be a little bit overwhelming. What we're finding on both the public and private side, however, is that, whatever technology that's going to help you make you feel safer and smarter and more connected, and we're always looking for partnerships that are out there. I think you are right in terms of it being local boots on the ground and making sure that there's a good connection and a level of comfort for what people are going through. When you look at some of the conversations that have been around lately, even in the metro Atlanta area about safety and security, there's been some pretty heated conversations and discussions. And it's not because the technology isn't out there. Technology is out there. How we best try to leverage it to help close some of those gaps, I think is still a conversation to be had. But I think we're definitely seeing that it is certainly a huge increase. That's one of the critical touch points of, I know where I made my decisions for where I want to live, and I want to feel safe when I go to work. And so trying to look at what are all of those elements. So I hope I'm answering the question that you're asked, but those trends are is just that these are just trying times. They are, and again, if you go through some of those emergency management training, and I just went through one last week in a leadership program that I'm going through now, and the first thing they said, and I pay attention to now, is understand all those X's, when you're coming into a certain particular place, and know your surroundings and trying to pay attention. So I think a lot of that is important. And a lot of those security systems that are out there, again, we don't know of all of the things that are out there, knowing to the naked eye is what I mean, but certainly for somebody in that security profession. But we have a very extensive portfolio. We also work a lot even in mixed-use developments and trying to come up with different lighting systems so that if there is an emergency situation that that green light area is a secure area, but where we see the red lights, that's where we have a problem, and where we put the yellow lights on, we're not totally sure. So I think there's a pretty broad portfolio of things that's out there, but it definitely still is a huge gap, if that answers.
I think one last thing on security. As long as you don't look at security, cybersecurity, what have you, as just a technology issue, I think we're on the right track. Because at the end of the day, some of the security breaches, and I think you're mentioning that, Denise, they don't all occur because we have now access and connectivity. I mean, some of it is just, someone leaving a door that they shouldn't be leaving open. We've had that problem with some of our clients working on the toll side, where people operating toll systems would just leave their toll booth open and, or their computers open and, exposed to potential hacking. Had nothing to do with technology, it just has to do with procedures.
Oh, yeah, one more.
Hello, my name is Tanya Hicks. I'm President and CEO of Power Solutions. I'm an electrical contractor, and I've been in business here for 18 years. I wanted to ask anyone on the panel or all of you, where do you see, this is a great discussion, where do you see an entry point for contractors or companies to participate in turning Atlanta into a smart city? A lot of the times we don't know how, where can we participate in a certain space, or, well, I'm familiar with Siemens. And you all do a lot to educate contractors like myself, so I recognize that. But anyway.
So I will speak from the city. perspective, and more so Watershed perspective, we actually have a group that does with vendor management. So coming out to the vendor fairs and things of that nature to learn about upcoming projects that are going to be going out for bid or going out for services or whatever the case might be. Also getting involved with, at the largest city effort, making sure you're a registered vendor with the city as well. But I think one of the good ways, especially for a smaller business, is to look for some of those larger companies that they can partner with to provide certain services, because in most governments, there are some minority business requirements that they must meet, and so they're always looking to meet those needs. So I think those will be some of the ways that I would say would be for an entry point. Definitely start with going to some of those vendor fairs and things of that nature to learn about the scope of services that are coming up. And usually at those events, you can meet those larger vendors as well, to where you can maybe join some type of partnership to come in as a JV to assist with delivering some of those services. So I would think that would be where you start. And then also getting registered as a vendor with the city.
I would add to it, probably the most beneficial collaborations have come from the informal networking. There is a group of people that are the entrepreneurs, the Georgia Tech graduates, whatever it might be, that are kind of pushing the envelope in terms of what could be done. They tend to hang out at the same sort of events, and you run into them over and over again. If you're at those events, you'll meet them and they'll talk about that thing that they've already gotten a relationship with the city or whatever. And you go, hey, we provide electrical services. And quite often they don't have the complete package of everything you need. They're looking for those subcontractors and other vendors. So I would say just being in that pool of people is probably quadrupling your probability of being involved in those sorts of activities. Yeah.
And I would add to that also, and stay ahead of those RFXs. You know, that
True.
scrambling in the end to try to find a partner is too late.
Yeah.
You know, so the more you can stay ahead and try to establish some of those relationships, definitely do so.
I will say this, government doesn't do a great job yet of creating that ecosystem of people that can respond to their needs. We're still trying to stand up our capability of even thinking differently. I'm hoping that as we stand up that capability, we'll start to help catalyze a community that can respond to those needs, right? Of people that have already been in the conversation and go, oh yeah, starting to see it. I don't know what the new term is, but I still have a Rolodex from the city that says, here are 100 companies that are doing things that are interesting, right? And so when an opportunity comes up, they're the first people I reach out to and say, hey, do you know somebody that can do, and they say, yeah, I got people, right? So it's that network effect. But I would say if you're interested in that space, hang out where the entrepreneurs are hanging out in Atlanta.
Thank you all for an informative afternoon. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience.